A man gets sentenced to house arrest for telling the truth. Not for lying, not for treason, not for anything that actually hurt anyone, just for being right when the establishment needed him to be wrong. That man was Galileo Galilei, and the story you think you know about him is almost certainly not the real one. Today, we're unpacking what Galileo actually proved, what really got him dragged before an inquisition, and the deeper pattern that a writer called An Unknown Soldier argues has been quietly driving academic history toward catastrophe ever since. By the end of this episode, you'll understand why the first great crack in the relationship between science and religion matters so much, what academia's fatal flaw actually is, and why it's been repeating itself for centuries. I've got someone here who has gone deep into this material, so let's get into it. Walk me through what's actually going on with Galileo.
So the first thing to understand is that Galileo doesn't exist in a vacuum. And An Unknown Soldier frames the entire story around a single invention, the optical lens, first developed by a scholar named Ibn Sal. And that lens, centuries later, becomes Galileo's fascination. It's the tool that makes everything possible.
Right, so it's not just Galileo being a lone genius. There's this whole chain of intellectual inheritance.
Exactly. And An Unknown Soldier makes this really interesting point about the Renaissance itself. The popular image is that the Renaissance was this sudden flowering of secular genius, but the argument here is that it actually began almost exclusively among Europe's monastic orders. The church was building libraries, preserving knowledge, laying the intellectual foundation, and by around 1250 AD, the early Renaissance was already well underway inside those walls.
So the church was essentially the university system of its day.
That's a really good way to put it. And An Unknown Soldier says something striking, that it was actually good that Galileo was not born a century earlier, because without the intellectual resources that 13th century Europe had built up, Galileo's thoughts could not have ranged as far as they did. The church's cup, as the essay puts it, filled and then flowed over into the wider world.
Okay, so now I have to ask about the thing that's going to make a lot of people uncomfortable, because most of us were taught in school that Galileo discovered the Earth was round.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm guessing that's not quite right?
It's not right at all, and An Unknown Soldier is pretty blunt about it. The essay says, and I'm quoting here, that the idea Galileo discovered the planet was a sphere is a terrific lie. And then the author takes a pointed shot, suggesting that everyone who was taught this was educated in public school, educated by the lowest bidder.
Okay, that's a strong take. So who actually gets credit?
Well, it goes back much further than Galileo. According to An Unknown Soldier, a man named Martin Behaim of Deutschland made a physical globe. He called it an earth apple, sometime between 1490 and 1492. Behaim was born in 1459 and died in 1507, so he and Galileo obviously never met. Galileo wasn't even a major figure yet when Behaim was already holding a physical model of a spherical Earth in his hands.
Wait, so there's a literal physical globe that predates Galileo's famous work?
Yes. And even Behaim's claim gets complicated because An Unknown Soldier points to Strabo, who wrote that a man named Crates of ancient Greece first depicted the Earth as a globe around 150 BC. That's nearly 1,714 years before Galileo was even born.
So the concept of a spherical Earth was floating around in academic circles for almost 2 millennia before Galileo.
Right. And here's where An Unknown Soldier makes a really important distinction. The author says the point isn't to establish beyond all argument who was first to suggest planets were spheres, it's to determine when the concept first appeared in academic circles. And clearly it existed in Greece nearly 1,714 years before Galileo. So what was Galileo actually doing?
Yeah, that's the question. If he didn't discover it, what was his actual contribution?
This is the part I find genuinely fascinating. And An Unknown Soldier draws a direct comparison to Einstein. The essay says that, like Einstein centuries later, Galileo's contribution to the sciences is found not in proposing new ideas, but in proving the ideas of others. Galileo proved that planets looked like spheres. He proved what Copernicus had proposed, a heliocentric model of the cosmos, using Ibn Sal's telescope.
So Galileo was the proof of concept, not the original concept.
Exactly. And that distinction matters enormously. Copernicus suggested the hypothesis that contradicted the Church's consensus, the terracentric model, where everything revolves around the Earth. Galileo didn't suggest it, he just proved it. And an unknown soldier notes that suggesting the church was wrong was altogether different from proving the church was wrong.
That's a meaningful difference. Like, a hypothesis is one thing, you can argue with it, dismiss it, but proof, that's a different kind of threat.
Exactly. And yet, even proving heliocentrism is not what an unknown soldier identifies as the thing that nearly brought Galileo to the gallows. And this is where the story gets really interesting.
Okay, now I'm genuinely curious. What was it?
Hubris. Pure and simple. Galileo began naming newly observed stars after his patrons, principally the powerful Medici family. He called them the Medici stars. The problem? They weren't stars. They were the moons of Jupiter.
Wait, he named the moons of Jupiter after a wealthy Italian family?
He did. And to the clergy who would eventually judge him at his Inquisition, this crossed a very specific red line. It appeared that Galileo was assuming near godlike authority, ascribing to Caesar what clearly belonged to God. And in doing so, he also appeared to be rewriting the Holy Bible, because it was on biblical interpretations that the church's entire consensus rested.
So it wasn't just the science, it was the optics of the science, the way it looked like he was positioning himself above the established order.
That's the argument. And an unknown soldier is very clear that Galileo was not practicing pseudoscience. His contribution was real, but his contribution was, in the author's words, in proving otherwise unoriginal thoughts on geometry. And for that, for telling the truth, he was sentenced to house arrest. The essay asks directly, how could a just society imprison a man in his own home just for telling the truth?
And that question still doesn't have a clean answer.
It doesn't. And that's where an unknown soldier pivots to the bigger argument, the one that frames this whole series. Because Galileo's story isn't just a historical curiosity, it's the first example of what the author calls an epiphanic threshold.
Okay, unpack that for me. What's an epiphanic threshold?
So the argument is that every time humanity crosses one of these thresholds, every time we gain paradigm-shifting knowledge, it creates dissonance among the intelligentsia. And that dissonance doesn't just stay in academic journals. It spills out into social upheaval and attending human rights violations. And here's the part that should make you sit up. With each new epiphany, the severity of the resulting upheaval is amplified.
So it's like a ratchet. Each time the stakes get higher.
And an unknown soldier uses exactly that metaphor, a ratcheting mechanism. And the author traces 13 of these thresholds in human history, all stemming from that single invention, Ibn Sal's lens. From Galileo's telescope to Van Leeuwenhoek's microscope, from Malthus to Darwin to Pasteur, each one opens a new crack between the world as people understood it and the world as it actually is.
That's a sweeping claim. 13 thresholds, all traceable back to one lens.
It is sweeping. And the author acknowledges it's not a comprehensive study, it's a deliberate choice to chart history from a single invention to show how one discovery after another defined what the essay calls the inevitable march toward the socialist holocaust of the 20th century. That's the destination the whole series is building towards.
Okay, so let's stay with the academic failure piece, because I think that's the part that's most relevant to Galileo specifically. What exactly is the fatal flaw an unknown soldier is diagnosing?
The diagnosis is a consistent failure of accredited academia to maintain the integrity of peer review. The result is that hypothesis gets presented to the general public as science, instead of mere hypothesis. And an unknown soldier is careful to say that Galileo himself was not doing this. Galileo was doing real science. But the pattern around him and after him is one where the failure of peer review allows bad ideas to masquerade as established truth.
And that's still happening today. That's not a historical problem.
Absolutely not. The author is very explicit that accredited academia, whether in Galileo's day or ours, exhibits a tendency to turn on anyone who challenges the accepted paradigm. And the essay notes that this tendency manifests in particularly acute forms every time there is a revolution in information technology. In the light of new information, old paradigms fall, and there is more than one ego attached to every paradigm that has ever failed.
That line about egos attached to paradigms, that's really the crux of it, isn't it?
It is. And an unknown soldier goes further with the diagnosis. The author argues that failures in peer review alone can't explain the dissonance that happens at these epiphanic moments. The only diagnosis that fully explains it is idolatry.
Idolatry? That's a loaded word. What does the author mean by it in this context?
It's a really precise use of the word. The essay defines it this way. When theologians are more devoted to their interpretations of Scripture than they are to manifest truth, that is a form of idolatry. When scientists are more devoted to their hypothesis than to manifest truth, that is also a form of idolatry. Same failure, different costume.
So the church officials who prosecuted Galileo and the scientists who later pushed pseudoscience as fact are guilty of the same fundamental error.
That's exactly the argument. And an unknown soldier takes it one step further. The author says that since everyone is, in some measure, both theologian and scientist, we are all susceptible to this idolatry. We believe what we believe for reasons we are convinced are justifiable. And when those justifications are exposed as fallacies, we are hard-pressed to abandon our beliefs because we define ourselves too much by what we believe.
That's uncomfortably accurate. Like, identity gets wrapped up in belief, and then challenging the belief feels like an attack on the person.
And an unknown soldier says that what every major religion instructs and what peer review of science enforces is that we are our own worst counsel. Accepting that is described as the most difficult challenge for any free-thinking individual to overcome. But it must be done.
There's something almost paradoxical about that. The institutions designed to check our worst intellectual impulses are themselves susceptible to those same impulses.
That's the paradox at the heart of the whole essay. And it's what makes Galileo's case so instructive. Here's a man doing genuine science, proving real things with a real instrument, and the system designed to pursue truth is the very system that imprisons him for it.
And the irony is that the church, which had built the intellectual infrastructure that made Galileo possible, was also the institution that couldn't handle what he found.
Exactly. And an unknown soldier doesn't frame this as an anti-religion argument. The essay is actually quite sympathetic to the church's role in preserving and building knowledge. The critique is specifically about what happens when any institution, religious or scientific, prioritizes the preservation of its own paradigm over the pursuit of truth.
Which is a critique that applies just as much to modern universities as it did to the medieval church.
The author makes that connection explicitly. And there's a moment in the essay where an unknown soldier admits to being personally concerned about academia's reception of their own contribution to the sciences. The author writes, "I pray my fellow believers keep me in their prayers, because the ride is about to get rough." There's something both vulnerable and defiant about that.
That's a very Galileo-esque thing to say, actually.
It really is, and I think that's intentional. The author is positioning themselves within the same tradition, someone who has found something true and is bracing for the institutional pushback that historically follows.
Let me push back on one thing, though. The argument that all of this, the Holocaust, the World Wars, traces back to Ibn Sal's lens and Galileo's telescope. Isn't that a bit of a stretch? Aren't there more proximate causes?
That's a fair challenge. And I think an unknown soldier would say the argument isn't that the lens caused the Holocaust in any direct sense. The argument is that the lens opened a crack between religious and scientific paradigms of understanding the world, and that crack widened with every subsequent epiphanic threshold. The Holocaust is the destination of a very long journey, not the result of a single cause.
So it's more about the pattern than the direct causation.
Right. And the pattern is what an unknown soldier wants us to see. The essay describes the schism between religion and science only widening after Galileo. By the end of the 19th century, the author says, the divorce between religion and science became final, specifically in 1905, with the proof that diseases were not punishments from God, but the biological consequences of pathogens. And from that point, the author argues, there was no way to stop what was coming.
That's a stark way to put it. No way to stop it.
And the essay does acknowledge that righteous people tried. And an unknown soldier points to figures like James Oglethorpe and his plan for the American colonies, and to the American Civil War as the world's first war against pseudoscience. Even Ulysses S. Grant gets credit for creating the public education system to try to stop the march. But to no avail, the author says. The march continued.
So there were people fighting back almost from the beginning. It's not like no one saw what was happening.
That's an important nuance. The essay is not fatalistic in the sense that it says no one tried. It's fatalistic in the sense that the structural flaw, the failure of peer review, the idolatry of paradigm was never fully corrected. And so the ratchet kept turning.
And Galileo is the first click of that ratchet.
The first epiphanic threshold, yes. The first moment where a genuine scientific proof collided with an entrenched institutional paradigm, and the institution chose the paradigm over the truth. Everything that follows, in an unknown soldier's framework, is a variation on that same collision.
So, when you step back from all of this, from Galileo's telescope to the moons of Jupiter to the idolatry of paradigm, here's what this really comes down to. The story we were told about Galileo is almost entirely wrong, and the real story is actually more disturbing.
More disturbing and more instructive. Galileo didn't discover the Earth was round. That idea is nearly 2,000 years older than him. What he did was prove what others had proposed, using a tool built on someone else's invention. His real contribution was the act of proof itself. And that act of proof, that commitment to manifest truth over institutional comfort, is what got him imprisoned.
And an unknown soldier is arguing that the same dynamic, institutions protecting paradigms over truth, is not a historical anomaly. It's a recurring feature of how accredited academia operates.
A recurring feature with escalating consequences. Each epiphanic threshold produces more severe upheaval than the last. And the diagnosis, idolatry, the devotion to belief over truth, applies equally to theologians and scientists. It applies to all of us, because we all define ourselves by what we believe, and we resist anything that threatens that definition.
Which means the solution isn't just better science or better religion. It's a harder thing. It's the willingness to be wrong about something you've built your identity around.
And an unknown soldier says that's what every major religion instructs and what peer review enforces, that we are our own worst counsel. The challenge is actually accepting that, not just intellectually, but in practice, when it's your paradigm on the line.
That's the actionable insight here, I think. Not just understanding Galileo's story differently, but asking yourself, what paradigm am I protecting right now? What truth am I not looking at because it would cost me something to see it?
That's exactly the question an unknown soldier wants readers to sit with. And it's not a comfortable question, but it's the right one.
Here's what I keep coming back to. Galileo was sentenced to house arrest for telling the truth. Not for lying, not for causing harm, for being right. And the system that imprisoned him was built by the same intellectual tradition that made his discoveries possible. That's not just a historical tragedy. That's a warning.
A warning that an unknown soldier argues we have not fully heeded. The essay ends with the observation that by the time the founders of the 20th century socialist movement met at Café Central in Vienna, the march toward the Holocaust was nearly complete. All that was needed was a spark, and the spark came. The question the series poses is whether we can learn to recognize the pattern before the next spark is struck.
That's a question worth sitting with.